You're listening to the VGBC. The following presentation of the Impostor Syndrome podcasts, Best Games or Bustcast, is brought to you by the Backlog Gaming Broadcast Company and by listeners and viewers like you. To learn more about how to support the BGBC, please follow the Impostor Syndrome podcast on Spotify, our host Eddie Akiba on Twitch at twitch.tv/Eddie_Akiba or by searching at Backlog Gaming Broadcast Company on YouTube. Good afternoon, listeners and viewers from the void. I am your host, Eddie Akiba, and you are listening to episode 1 of the Impostor Syndrome podcast, aka the Impostor Syndrome podcast, Best Games or Bustcast, aka the BGBC on the BGBC. And today we're going to be talking about the 1982 video game Atlantis for the Atari 2600, as well as the launch of this podcast. So thank you for listening and watching. If you're just joining me for the first time, well, this is the first time. I am broadcasting live from the Misty Mountains in parts unknown. And this is a podcast where I talk about my favorite games of all time. And who might I be? Nobody, of course. An imposter, as they say. I'm a person who simply loves video games, who wants to share that story with the world. Or at least my cat and 2 dogs, who I at least know will be listening and watching. I know what you're saying. What the world really needs right now is another podcast, but at least humor me. Every month, I'm going to be talking about a different one of my favorite games of all time on my personal top 50 goated games of all time list, with a few honorable mentions thrown in for good measure. I also plan on hosting at least 2 movie watch-alongs each month as an added bonus for the terminally bored. So be sure to stick around to the end to find out when, where, and what you can watch on the Backlog Gaming Broadcast Company and the Impostor Syndrome podcast. This being episode 1, I thought where better to start than the Atari 2600 and Atlantis, a game released in 1982 by one of the very first third-party video game publishers named Imagic. Now let me get this out of the way though first. This is not necessarily a video game history podcast, though from time to time I may talk a little bit about the development of my favorite games and the people behind them. But for the most part, I want to talk about how my favorite games shaped my life. You see, I've always loved video games. They've been my primary hobby for most of my life. Video games have made me laugh. Video games have made me cry. Video games have made me a better person. Have let me meet even better people. That's the story I want to tell with this podcast. I have a lot of video games. I have I have loved a lot of video games in my lifetime. But each of the games that I'm going to cover in my podcast have a story behind them, a story that's part of my life. Now, whether those are interesting stories, that's up to you, listeners and viewers, to decide. I think we sometimes focus far too often on the negative, toxic side of the video game community. And make no mistake, there are those elements in every fandom, video games included. But I think we often mistake the loudest voices as the voices that represent this community the most. I simply don't believe that's the case. In my experience, the video game community is amazing. It's among the most compassionate, welcoming, and thoughtful group of people that I've ever interacted with. So if you're wondering if this podcast is meant for you, all I can say that everybody's welcome here. And I want to try to do my best to make sure that's true for the BGBC as well. Now, despite my mother being a Chicago native and my father growing up in the Boston, New England area, I've lived my entire life in what can be just best described as farm country in the middle of nowhere, Nowheresville, USA. Real tumbleweed blowing in the wind type places. Currently, I live in a rural city on top of a mountain. For me, video games were my ticket to experiencing the outside world, different cultures and ideas, whether that meant interacting with video game fans from all over the world on the nerdy nether regions of millennial era message boards, to marveling at the otherworldliness and futuristic cityscapes of popular Japanese culture depicted in 1990s video game magazines, movie, and manga. And for me, a short, shy, and let's be honest here, pretty geeky kid who wasn't all that great at sports, Growing up in a somewhat small-minded town could be kind of tough. Kids are cruel, as they say. So while I learned to get by in life with very few friends, video games were often among my sole source of comfort when I was my most lonely or depressed. What other medium in the world can let a scrawny kid who sucks at sports, who lives in the middle of nowhere, experience the feeling of saving the world with a ragtag collection of like-minded adventurers? Or even the feeling of falling in love with the not-so-damsel in distress warrior queens of my favorite RPGs. Video games are also what inspired me to create this podcast and to start live streaming on Twitch and YouTube, despite falling squarely into the quote-unquote unk demographic. Another reason why I want to start this podcast and start live streaming is because video games are changing. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Games are everywhere now. There are games for everybody. It's never been a better time to be a gamer. What is changing is that the games that are considered the most, quote, successful, often cost so much to make and take so long to make that there's so little room for risk. And in some cases, creativity. Everything has to appeal to the biggest market possible so it can make the most money possible. What happens is, somewhat of stagnation to a certain degree. Again, this isn't me complaining about video games. I don't think like I said, it's never been a better time to be a gamer. I'm well aware I've probably aged myself out of the primary demographic for video games. And if I were a teenager, I think, this was like the best era of gaming of all time. And that's kind of like this same with any medium, whether that's music or movies. It's what you see when you're the youngest that has the biggest impression on you. So it's not, yes, times are changing, but, us oldies, these calls that, there's going to be another crash. I don't think that's going to happen. Anyway. One of the reasons I wanted to start this podcast is I could kind of feel my interest starting to wane a little bit in what's considered the mainstream and most popular video games in the market. So many of these games are either so long or require such a time commitment that they can sometimes start feeling like work. What I want to do with this podcast is go back and play those games I consider my favorites and see if they still hold up. And also by starting my YouTube channel, I've committed myself to playing games in my backlog. They're not your typical AAA mega blockbusters. I really want to take this opportunity to explore more indie titles or lesser-known games because increasingly I found that my favorite modern games of all time are more and more independent games rather than big tentpole blockbusters. I know that sounds kind of pretentious, and don't get me wrong, I like my big, super expensive AAA games as much as the next guy. But sometimes I want to switch it up, try something different. So I'm going to try to temper my natural habit to jump on the next big AAA hotness that I may find disappointment in, and rather direct my gaming energy to playing indie titles and titles from the past. And also my backlog, because I'm that person that buys tons of games on sale and then never ends up playing them. And so I want to make an effort to change that. I want to actually play the games that I purchase. Where better to start this podcast than the beginning? One of my favorite movies growing up was David Lynch's Dune, despite the fact that David Lynch himself reportedly hated working on that film. But anyway, in the very beginning of that film, the regal Princess Irulan, played by Virginia Madsen at the time, stares into the camera, a backdrop of brilliant stars and galaxies behind her, and tells us, the audience, that, quote, a beginning is a very delicate time. I think about that long when I think about the early history of video games. I think for a lot of people, when they think about the birth of video games, they almost picture it like the Big Bang. People often think that Pong simply manifested out of thin air at a bar in California, or that after the great video game crash of 1983, that it was just the dark ages of gaming until Nintendo came along and saved everything. In terms of actually experiencing it and being alive and playing games on the Atari 2600 back in the day, that I can tell you is not what it felt like. Granted, we were just children after all. We weren't watching dramatic TV news reports about the doomed video game industry. And in fact, I don't even think we knew a crash happened until we were much older. I often think of the beginning as really not the beginning at all. Pong itself is based off of Ralph Baer's tennis, created in the 1960s, although he'll never admit that, but they were sued. And anyway, it's a long story. You should look into that. And that tennis, which Ralph Baer created, was later ported to the Magnavox Odyssey, a game console that people rarely talk about, but that was released all the way back in 1972, far before my birth and time. But even after the Odyssey and before the Atari 2600, there were countless dedicated Pong consoles on the market, like those developed by Atari themselves. Companies like Telstar and Coleco and Sears come to mind. Even Nintendo, before the fabled NES or Famicom, as it's known in Japan, released their own Pong home console called the Color TV Game 6. So while I am among the generation that was the first to grow up with video games were very much already around well before the Atari 2600, and which was my family's first video game console when we were growing up. So when I say the beginning, what I mean to say this is the beginning of my video game story. Why I wanted to focus on Atlantis in this first episode is because, much like the mythical advanced lost civilization, for most, even older gamers, the Atari 2600 seems so cut off from their own experiences. It's something that's talked about as if it was the primordial precursor to home video games. And often people think that Atari games are so primitive that they're either just not worth your time or they're just so simple that they couldn't possibly be fun. That's what they think. And that's simply not the case. If anything, the Atari 2600 proves that games can still be fun despite extremely limited hardware limitations, and that boiled down, even the simplest game designs can be overwhelmingly fun and addictive if executed properly. Now, don't get me wrong, there's plenty of crappy Atari games. A plethora of crappy games, is of course why the first great crash happened. But the difference between a good Atari game and a crappy Atari game is night and day. Much like, say, the difference between Super Mario Brothers on the NES versus Bart versus the Space Mutants on the NES. People would be, NES fans, people who grew up with the Nintendo, the original Nintendo, would be aghast if you judge the entire Nintendo 8-bit library on Bart versus the Space Mutants. So why is it so often that we judge the Atari based on classic stinkers like E.T., or the Atari 2600 port of Pac-Man, or even communist mutants from space? And yes, that's a real Atari 2600 game. What makes Atlantis so special to me is that it serves as an anchor from my gaming past, kind of like how a song you used to like in high school or smell of a certain type of food or fragrance can instantly trigger a memory. The Japanese word for that feeling is natsukashi. Please murder me if I pronounce that terribly. I'm sure I murdered it. It means small things that bring you suddenly, joyously back to fond memories. Much like dreams, I only remember brief images or snapshots of my early childhood growing up in Texas when our family had an Atari 2600. But being the youngest of 5, playing Atari is one of the things I vividly remember. See, growing up, our family loved games, not just video games, but board games, puzzles, playing sports in the backyards, that type of thing. My parents even had Scrabble dates back before we were born. So there was always healthy competition amongst my siblings, and playing games like those on the Atari were one of the ways we could express that. And back then, we're talking pre-internet and pre-cable TV. We're talking about Texas. It would get so hot in Texas in the summer that if you left your shoes outside, the rubber soles would melt to the pavement. There were also just crazy creatures and wildlife in Texas. We used to have these things in the backyard called horny toads that were lizards that could shoot blood from their eyelids. Spiders seemed like the size of small hedgehogs. So what do you do when you have 5 kids? And outside it's hotter than the surface of the sun, crawling with Fallout-esque nightmare creatures. You play video games. Now, while Atari was a part of our life growing up, video games weren't yet the sole focus of my interests. That was the beginning, after all, before I became a, quote, gamer with a capital G, as they say. God, that sounds cringe. I hate that word. Atari was something me and my brothers and sisters would often just sit around our brown shag carpet and the small wood grain color CRTV in our living room and play. My oldest brother, we call K for short, was the best. We would watch him play games for hours. My sisters loved games like Miss Pac-Man and Frogger, which, unlike the original Pac-Man port, Miss Pac-Man on the 2600 was actually, a pretty decent port considering the hardware. And we often would recreate the Olympics with Activision's Decathlon, getting Mario Party-esque blisters long before Mario Party existed. Atlantis, for me, is so special because I feel it demonstrates the perfect simplicity of the best early arcade and Atari games. And it's one of the few games from that era that I can still find enjoyable today. I still play it. I still played it after my family moved from Texas to Maryland, and it's one of the few Atari games that I can remember playing regularly before that mythical day that my oldest brother came home from his part-time job in high school at the local dollar movie theater with the Nintendo Entertainment System in his hand, which would truly change my gaming life forever and would mark the point at which I truly started playing with power, as they say. So how would I describe Atlantis? I would describe Atlantis as kind of a cross between a game like Space Invaders or Galaxian mixed with Missile Command. The game is set in the fabled civilization of Atlantis, where the cities are under attack by the invading Gorgon vessels that have planned to destroy the city. Now, according to Wikipedia, again, highly researched and professional podcast here, the goal of the game is to defend Atlantis from the Gorgon vessels before they destroy it with their death rays. The player can fire at the invading Gorgon sentry vessels from either the Acropolis command post or the sentry posts on each side of the screen. The smaller, faster ships are worth more points. The Gorgon fleets attack in waves. At the end of every wave, the player receives points for each part of Atlantis that is not destroyed. For every 10,000 points, a destroyed part of Atlantis is restored at the end of a wave. Points are gained for shooting vessels. The smaller ships are worth a higher total, and shooting them with assigned sentry guns earns more points. Each city in the game you have to protect has a force field that protects it, and that is powered by the Acropolis post. Once that is destroyed, the cities and the surrounding infrastructure are left vulnerable. So what does that mean if you've never played Atlantis? Well, if you're watching this on Twitch, YouTube, or Spotify video, you'll see footage of me playing the game in the background. For audio listeners only, basically on the bottom of the screen, you'll see a collection of pixels meant to represent the underwater domed cities of Atlantis, surrounded by communication towers and a bridge. In the middle of the screen, perched above the water level, is one of the 3 player-controlled anti-aircraft guns or lasers known formally as the Acropolis post. It's basically a big cannon in the middle of the screen. The other 2 cannons, or sentries, are located on the left and right-hand sides of the screen, respectively. You have full control over all of the cannons independently by holding down a directional on the joystick and pressing the fire button. For example, if you hold left on the joystick and press the fire button, you'll fire the left sentry gun. The enemies are spaceships that move horizontally across the screen, increasingly faster waves. Now, there are different types of enemy ships. Some are bigger bombers that are slow. Others are super fast that streak across the screen that if you hit, they explode like the Death Star in Star Wars, and which has a screen-clearing effect if you time your shots just right. If you fail to shoot down the enemy spaceships, they will slowly creep lower and lower down the screen with each pass, eventually firing laser beams at the Acropolis post, your gun emplacements, and the cities of Atlantis below. The game ends when all your cannons in the cities of Atlantis are destroyed. The game over screen is a dramatic escape of the survivors of a UFO that would later become the subject of another Imagic game called Cosmic Ark. It was a spiritual successor, a companion game to Atlantis, which I actually just played on stream on the other night on Friday. Or was it Saturday? I think it was Saturday. I forget. My memory is so terrible. But that game holds up good too. If you like Atlantis, play Cosmic Ark. That game's great too. What makes Atlantis interesting is it doesn't rely on the typical live-based game mechanics of other space shooters like Space Invaders. And much like Missile Command, if you earn enough points, then previously destroyed portions of Atlantis will respawn. Having multiple guns that can be destroyed is a cool mechanic too. In Atlantis, you can lose your middle cannon to enemy fire, but then survive multiple waves simply by using your right and left guns, earning enough points for the Acropolis to respawn. The genius of Atlantis is the higher the score, the higher the chance that parts of the city will respawn. In Atlantis, you can desperately rally, much like a heated volley in a tennis match. All the while, the enemy waves become increasingly faster and faster to the point that the ships are finally flying across the screen at light speed. And explosion after laser blast pops off in a cacophony of flashing lights and early video game sound effects. And it's all covered in rainbows. That's right, it was the 1980s. Much like the packaging on Imagic's physical game boxes, everything in Atlantis is covered in rainbows. Sorry, haters, video games have always been woke. And there's no end to Atlantis. It's one of those games that I consider timeless. And by timeless, I mean both a game that you can play repeatedly over and over again. Also it's just a game that despite its age, you can always go back to and still have fun with. I consider Atlantis to be among those style of just one more type games like Punch-Out or Hades. It's also timeless in the sense that it can go on forever. And that's the beauty of early video games. Most of them are just high score type games that you can play repeatedly over and over to talent challenge, to try to beat your own high score or your friends' high scores. You'll always lose, but much like Sisyphus, the joy is found in being happy with losing well. And I am not great at Atlantis. Like, I enjoyed it, have a lot of fun with it. Here recently I've been playing, I think I capped out just below 60,000 points in my best run so far. I think the high score in Atlantis, if you look it up, is something like 8,500,000 or something crazy like that. It's because the people that are like good at, like, just crazy good at Atlantis can play it forever. They can play it without getting shot down. And they had a competition, I think it was like in Honolulu or something like that, where the guy that made Atlantis, he made like a modified version called Atlantis 2, which you can find on emulators. That makes the game harder. It was specifically designed for those people that could just play it forever and ever and ever. I am not one of those people. I just like it because it's fun. Now, as part of this podcast, for a little fun, I want to include at least one snippet of a positive review and at least one snippet of a negative review, just so you can get an idea of what other random people on the internet think about my favorite games of all time. Now, Atlantis is difficult because there's no Metacritic or OpenCritic reviews of that game. So here are two excerpts from Atlantis reviews I found on the ancient video game website known as GameFAQs.com, which is also, ironically, the first message board I was a member of 3 million years ago. I'll start with the negative review first, since that's apparently the only thing that drives in social media engagement these days online. It's a 4 out of 10 review. It's short. It's not very well written. There's a bunch of grammatical errors, but I'm going to read it in a silly voice. So, the game is exactly the same as Missile Command for Windows, except the graphics are nowhere near MC being Missile Command, editor's note. In the beginning, it is fun, but when it's progressing, it'll be button bashing. The 4 modes will keep you this game a bit longer playing, but maybe 4 is even a too high a score for this game. So again, highly, highly thoughtful criticism from the most negative of us. Here's a positive review. I believe this person gave it, I believe it's like a 7 or 8. It's one of the more high reviews. What can I say about Atlantis in closing? Well, it's a bit like Missile Command and Space Invaders in one package. It is a great, colorful city to defend with plenty of enemies with excellent effects to defend them from. It's action-packed and insane on your fingers, but well worth picking up and playing if you can still find a cat floating around. And, kind of give you a feel of 1982, the era we're talking about. I know for you younger listeners, 1982 might as well be the Stone Age, but, some of us were alive back then, yes. I know. It's amazing we're not dead yet. Anyway, so I'm going to play a little Casey Kasem and spit out some random trivia from the day. Casey Kasem was a guy who's always on your radio. There's top counting down. Oh, no. Slight audio malfunction. I am very bad at this. I'm very new to this. Okay. So yeah, Casey Kasem, he was a guy on the radio. I don't know. I don't think people listen to radios these days anymore either. That's them showing my age. Hey, he would give a little good tidbits about stuff in between songs on the radio. So just can I give you an idea of like what was going on in 1982? The 54th Academy Awards were hosted by Johnny Carson, and Chariots of Fire won Best Picture. In June of that summer, E.T. the Extraterrestrial, which I'll be hosting a watch-along of, not next Sunday, but the Sunday after that, is released in the United States, or was released in the United States. It was directed by Steven Spielberg. Became the biggest box office hit for the next 11 years. First International Day of Peace was proclaimed in 1982 by the United Nations, and Time Magazine's Person of the Year is given for the first time to a non-human, the computer. Some of the songs we were listening to back in the day in 1982 included Physical by Olivia Newton-John. I may have a few core memories associated with that music video. Eye of the Tiger of Rocky fame by a survivor, and I Love Rock and Roll by Joan Jett and the Blackhearts. Fantastic band. And in this year of our Lord, 1982, Atlantis was released. Atlantis was designed by Dennis Coble, who had previously worked for Atari, and later left to form Imagic. There's a panel discussion he hosted that you can find on YouTube about the history of Imagic during the Portland Retro Gaming Expo back in 2016. That's super interesting. Basically, Atari had started out as a very small, close-knit company, and it was immediately dwarfed by its own financial success with the explosion and popularity of home video games and arcade games. So it was eventually sold to the Suits Time Warner, and basically the Suits took over, and Atari became a much larger company. But it lost some of that independent kind of spirit that led to their initial success. Early Atari was very much, in the spirit of, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, for better or worse. I mean, there's a lot of worse attached to that. But there's a lot of freedom attached with that as well. But anyway, so let's see here. Coble decided, he wanted to form kind of like a satellite office or a subsidiary of Atari that was basically a small, hand-picked team to kind of recapture that early kind of spirit. When he presented the idea to one of his fellow colleagues, they basically told him, you have all this thought out, this seems like a great idea, why don't you just start your own company? So that's what he did. He did with a few other people and developers. At the time, video games were so profitable that the investors were practically throwing money at them. So they didn't have any issues raising the money from investors to start their own gaming company. Researching a little bit of the making of Atlantis, I found it quite interesting how much the game industry seemed so different back then, but also how much of it seems to be the same. There's a PBS documentary that you can find on YouTube called Entrepreneurs that gives a brief snippet of the development of Atlantis, where they followed Coble around. Despite Atari games being considered primitive by today's standards, the game industry was already raking in millions and millions of dollars back then, which gave rise to third-party publishers like Imagic. Activision at the time was the most popular. Back in the day when the Atari 2600 released, the games were made by Atari. There weren't actually third-party publishers. The actual game developers and designers weren't credited, or they didn't receive any bonuses, or if they did, it was meager, especially if the games were hit. Whereas today, you might say something like, okay, Super Mario Brothers, that was made by Shigeru Miyamoto, or Metal Gear, that was made by Hideo Kojima. And I guess I'm being reductionary. I know that more people worked on those games than those two. But when you think about those games, you think about, okay, this guy headed that development, Back then, if you asked Atari who made Pong, Nolan Bushnell would just say Atari. Unlike today, when a game development studio can consist of thousands of people across multiple continents, back then a game was typically made by one or two people. 3, maybe, if you're getting, complicated. Entire game's code might take up only, 1 or 2 pages, but still sell millions of copies and take a few months to create. Now imagine you're a game designer who spent a few months making it working just insane. Crunch existed back then too, where they would work overtime. Now imagine you've been crunching for months to get this game out the door, and for Atari, and it goes on to sell millions of copies, and you see your bosses raking in that sweet, sweet dough, that cash money. But you're not credited. You're just making, peanuts in comparison. I'm sure they were making decent money, but not like, if you sell millions of copies and you're only pulling in like, I don't want to even guess, what happened was some game designers thought, why don't we go in to business for ourselves and reap the reward and profits of our hard work? That's how we got our first third-party publishers. Activision. Activision was the first third-party publisher. Atari tried to stop it, but the courts let it happen. Like Activision, Imagic was a successful third-party publisher. In 1982, according to Wikipedia, the company sold $48 million worth of games, with Demon Attack being its most popular title. Now, Demon Attack, that was developed by a guy named Rob Fulop, who was previously a programmer at Atari, and allegedly claimed in a 2019 interview with Paleotronic magazine that he left the company in favor of Imagic after being paid for developing the Atari 2600 port of Missile Command with a Safeway coupon for a free turkey rather than the Christmas bonus he'd expected. So he probably went, Clark Griswold from National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation on them, if you've ever seen that movie. Now, take that with a grain of salt. Again, that's coming from Wikipedia. But Coble himself, in that retro gaming panel he hosted, mentioned that when he was at Atari, the developer of the port of Space Invaders for the Atari 2600 was so offended and upset when Atari decided to give him a measly $3,000 bonus for the sales of Space Invaders, that dude just stopped showing up to work. They still paid him. What do you got to do? That's the guy who ported Space Invaders to the 2600 cartridge that sold gangbusters. Back then, like, a game was made by like one person, maybe two, right? And if you guys making Space Invaders, you're not gonna just let him go free agent. Like, come on. So you can kind of get a sense about the feelings of those early game developers, a lot of whom seemed like computer whiz geniuses for the era. Probably some neurodivergence in there, if I'm being honest. The 2600 was basically made to play Pong well, and the fact that anything more advanced than Pong ever came out is pretty crazy. If you read about the hardware limitations of the 2600, or any like documentaries about like the making of Atari games and how they developed that technology from the really primitive components that they had at the time. Games are profitable. What resulted was a literal gold rush. The games were so new that it was like magic. Since the 1950s, television had been this passive experience. Games let you interact with television. It was our first experience with what we would call today as emergent storytelling. That's what they call it today. Games sold like hotcakes. In the case of Atlantis, Coble himself worked at a profit-sharing deal where he earned a certain percent of profits for any copy of Atlantis that was sold, much like how developers today receive bonuses based on things like Metacritic scores. Selling a lot of copies meant making a lot of money if you were a game designer back then, especially if that game was made by one person. Atlantis, according to this PBS documentary, I can't talk today, had a marketing budget of $2.5 million in 1982 money. Okay, that's how lucrative Atari games were back then. So if you ever watch gameplay footage of Atari games and you're thinking like, what is this? How could people play this stuff? Like, this is so like, people loved this stuff back in the day. Like, we had a blast playing this thing, And like I said, sometimes the simplest games designs are the funnest, Of course, that gold rush is what eventually led to the crash, because everybody, including Atari, wanted to get rich quick by releasing anything on the Atari. I can remember there was like a game based on a dog food brand. I think it was like Chuckwagon or something like that. Stuff like that, Like, imagine Alpo releasing a game on the Nintendo Switch and it's just dog shit, But like, imagine every company's doing that. That's what would like the crash. That's what created the crash. Closest modern equivalent I can think of is, for example, like people might be offended by this, but like in the heyday of Wii, it was so successful that the term shovelware began to take on a new meaning with the amount of hastily rushed out games that wind up in the bargain bin. Uh, Now, that's not a slight against the Wii. I love my Wii. The same happened with the PS2, or it happens with any console of a certain level of success. Definitely, if you look at any of the modern platform storefronts like the eShop or a PSN store or Steam, if you look at those 99 cents free to start, free to play games, a lot of those are just garbage, you know? The kind of greed and desire to make every game an even bigger and bigger financial success was what inevitably led to the crash because the market got flooded. You know, even back then, video games were big risk, big rewards type of investment, with many games failing to turn a profit. It's a shame then that the history of Atari games are colored by the worst shovelware released on the system. For me, growing up in Texas, Atari was what video games were to me. I mean, don't get me wrong, video games were actually quite prevalent back then, or at least arcades were, but it wasn't really until the second golden age of arcades in the 90s that I started regularly going to arcades. For me, most of my gaming was done on Atari, playing games like Atlantis. You know, we did have a Chuck E. Cheese where I lived growing up, so we would go there a lot of times, and they had great arcade games. You know, if we traveled, you'd see arcade games, that kind of thing. But really, Atari was like the primary outlet for me playing video games back in the early 1980s until the release of the NES. It didn't even cross my mind that home video games could get any better than the Atari. Atari was just Atari, kind of like how your grandmother called every video game console the Nintendo, you know? I was just a dumb kid, and I thought the Atari was going to be the pinnacle of video games. I didn't think it could get any better. Now, of course, back then, my older brother also had an Intellivision, and I believe an Intellivision 2, which were more advanced than the Atari, more graphically powerful, but never could really get into them, because if you've ever played with them, the controls are just so complicated. With the Intellivision, imagine like a cordless phone from the 1990s with like big number keypads, you know? And what you would do is you would put game unique overlays on these big phone looking controllers, and that's how you would play the games. Sounds confusing and unintuitive? Well, you're right. Was. So for me, and we didn't get an S until probably 1988 at the earliest. It was probably closer to 1989, probably maybe even early 1990s, so I'm being honest. So games like Atlantis were still what I thought of when I thought of video games, and this were still the games that I played, you know, which is a testament to how addictive and fun that game is, you know. So, and you know, even today, I've had a blast playing. I've been playing it on stream here past couple of weeks, and it's just great. It's one of those one more type of games, you know. It's one of those where if you get in the zone, you can really just keep. It's just really addictive. It's got great sound effects. It's got great graphics effects for the time, you know. So that's why Atlantis is one of my favorite games of all time, and why it became a favorite for a lot of players. If you ask a lot of Atari fans from back in the day, they'll mention Atlantis. They know Atlantis. Atlantis is one of the good ones. You know, it's one of the good games. Now, although Imagic grew quickly in the early years, it was irreparably harmed by the video game crash in 1983. According to Wikipedia, it released 24 games before going out of business by 1986. Koval continued working in the industry on games such as Sonic Spinball. I remember that. I don't think it was greatly well received. He also worked on the PGA Golf Series, which was great. The early iterations of PGA Golf from Electronic Arts. Most notably, Koval worked as the director of software at Electronic Arts, and later became the vice president of technology at Universal Studios. Now that I've spent some time talking about Atlantis, let me wrap up by expressing my thanks for anyone listening, as well as to let you know where and what you can expect to watch and listen to here on the Impostor Syndrome podcast and the Backlog Gaming Broadcast Company. It's easy for us to retreat into our habits and seek comfort in the solitude of our favorite games and movies or music or hobbies, especially when we feel powerless. There's one thing that video games have taught me other than to never give up, the power of friendship, and to always look behind the waterfall. It's the beauty of creativity and self expression. Mind you, it doesn't have to be good. That's not the point. For example, I doubt this will become your favorite podcast. I will be shocked if I manage to land 10 concurrent viewers on Twitch in the next 5 years. And the production quality of this one man show will likely be public access equivalent at best. Again, that's not the point. If you try to catch my stream earlier today, it was a dumpster fire disaster because apparently OBS doesn't like it when you pull out HDMI cords and try to switch HDMI cords. It nuked my sound settings. It was a disaster, but for the most part, I've been doing okay. Again, this is a hobby. I'm not doing this to make money. I'm not doing this for the likes and the subscribes. I'm not going to be that person. It'd be great if you want to support me. If you give me likes and subscribes or subs to my channel, that'd be great. That's not why I'm doing this. I'm doing this because, I'm at the point in my life where, I kind of want to, if I'm going to do something like this, I need to do it now. Because I've always wanted to share my love and passion in video games. Somehow, I've just never had the outlet to do it or like the wherewithal to dedicate myself to doing it. So these past couple months, I've been, learning OBS, learning how to stream, learning the video production. It's going to be touch and go. So, so getting back to again, the point is not to make something that is necessarily good. The point is just to be yourself, to do it. That's the fun part. To live as authentically as you can, ethics allowing, and to make something. Tell your stories because each and every one of you matters. I want you to know that. Each and every one of you matters. So if this is the only episode of this podcast you ever listen to, first, thank you. And second, go do that thing you've always wanted to do. Go write that song. Learn to play the guitar. Start that Kiss tribute band in your garage. Even just take a picture in photo mode of your favorite game and post it on the internet. It doesn't matter if you fail, if it's good or not, so long as you can say that you let your voice be heard. That being said, if you'd like to join me on this journey that, most likely statistically unlikely reach completion, here's what you can expect. I've read that the average podcast lasts 3 episodes. So if I can get past 3 episodes, I win, So, but anyway, so this is what I'm doing. For those who are new to the Backlog Gaming Broadcast Company, new to the Impostor Syndrome podcast, this is what you kind of expect. Again, this is like a work in progress. I'm gonna, I've got some schedule like kind of set in stone right now, but that could evolve over time. But anyway, each month I'm going to be hosting a podcast about one of my favorite games of all time. In addition, I'm going to be playing at least one retro game that's like thematically related to the game of the month that I'm playing. For example, this month I've been playing Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis, which is the classic point-and-click adventure game by LucasArts. Again, Fate of Atlantis, see how they're kind of connected. So I'm going to try to do that, kind of make like the retro game thematically related to the game that I'm playing or covering for the podcast. I'm also going to be playing an RPG every month. Now, it might not be a different RPG every month because RPGs are my favorite genre. So what I do is I buy these massively long RPGs, play them for a few hours, and then move on to the next one. I'm going to try to stop that. I'm going to try to stop the bleeding today. So every Saturday morning, I'm going to have the Saturday morning RPG show. I'll get into that here in a minute. So we got a retro game, we got an RPG. Also, importantly, I've got a different game from my backlog that I'm going to be playing every month again because I want to tackle my backlog. I want to try out different indie games. I want to try out those games that are just sitting there in my backlog. They might be bigger games, they might be AAA type games, but I want to try out like indie games, stuff there that has just been hanging out in my backlogs. My shame, some of the classics that I haven't played yet. I want to try to knock those out. And so you have the RPG, you've got the retro game, you got the game of the month, and you have the backlog game, right? So I'm probably forgetting something. I really messed that up. That's all right. Now, much like wrestling, though, the card and show times are subject to change. until further notice, at least for this month, this is what the schedule I'm doing. Again, this might change from month to month as I get comfortable with my schedule. So, follow me I'm on Blue Sky, Eddie Akiba. Go hit me up with a follow or like. Um, so every Thursday night at 6 p.m. Eastern, you can watch the Retro Replay Thursday, also known as the Thursday Retro Replay. That starts at 6 p.m. Eastern. Then we have Friday. Friday night is the Friday free play, starting at 6 p.m. Eastern as well, which will be dealer's choice. So any game that I feel like playing that night on Friday is what I'm going to be playing on the Friday free play. I'm going to try to focus on like the game of the month and the backlog game of the month, but I might throw in some wild cards in there. Like here, last Friday I did like a Atari night where I played a bunch of Atari games. So again, dealer choice, and then that's followed again Saturday mornings at 10:30 a.m. Eastern time with the Saturday morning RPG show on Twitch and YouTube again, because RPGs, like I said, are my favorite genre of video games, and I just have an ever-increasing backlog of RPGs that I need to get around to playing. Since it's a new year, that means New Year's resolution, and by New Year's resolution this year is to finally play and finish Chrono Trigger, of course, which is considered to be one of the best RPGs of all time. I was a Sega kid. I did not have an SNES growing up, so I'm going to be trying to play some of the classics. So I've been playing that all month here, every Saturday. Chrono Trigger. Just remember, kids. Console wars are stupid because you'll inevitably miss out on some of the best games if you just stick to one platform because of blind loyalty to a corporation that literally probably doesn't care that you exist. Okay. Every Saturday afternoon, starting at 4 p.m. Eastern, join me on the BGBC and Twitch for the Saturday afternoon main event, during which I'll be playing the game of the month. In this case, it's been Atlantis, although I've been switching stuff up too. Every Sunday morning at 11 a.m. Eastern, you can join me for the Backlog Blitz on Twitch and on YouTube, during which I'll be playing a game from my backlog. This month, I've been playing Ace Combat 7 Skies Unknown, which is a arcade flight simulator type game, heavy focus on arcade. Finally, join me every Sunday afternoon at 4 p.m. Eastern for the bonus round, for a short extra round of gaming goodness. So I'm planning on the first and third Sundays of every month on the BGBC to be a free play Sunday, which I'll just choose something that I'm going to play for like an extra hour. Now, every second Sunday of the month on the bonus round, I'll be recording the Impostor Syndrome podcast live at 4 p.m. Eastern on Twitch, and it'll be simulcast on YouTube. And then on the fourth Sunday of every month, so not next Sunday, but the Sunday after that, I'll be hosting an informal chat starting at 4 p.m. Eastern on Twitch called The Best of the Rest, during which I'll share some of my closing thoughts on the games I've been playing during the month. It may turn into a bonus podcast that might be like an extra for subscribers or something like that. For right now, I'm just starting out. I want to get as much content out there for you guys as possible. Again, this isn't grade A S tier material. There's a lot more better podcasts out there. I'm just doing this for fun, man. I'm doing it. It's just like doing it punk rock style. Okay. Now, following the podcast and chat on the second and fourth Sunday of the month, I'll be hosting a movie watch along. Now, tonight, I was planning on hosting a movie watch along of Indiana Jones and Raiders of the Lost Ark, but I lost a significant amount of time today due to technical issues with OBS. And I still got to get my scenes set up for my movie watch-alongs because I'm trying not to get copyright stricken, as they say. So I'm kind of doing creative ways that we can do a watch-along where, I'm not going to get copyright stricken. So I apologize that you're not going to get your first movie watch-along this evening, but I'm going to hit me up next Sunday, we're gonna be doing a watch along at 5:30 p.m. Eastern on the channel. Okay. Um, and again on the fourth Sunday of the month. So the last Sunday of the month, I'm gonna be hosting another watch along. I'm gonna be hosting E.T. the Extraterrestrial. Again, big box office hit in the '80s. One of my favorite movies of all time. I still cry every time I watch that movie. Again, thematically related to the stuff we've been playing this month. Actually, the guy that made E.T., the famous, what people say is the worst game of all time. I don't think it's the worst game of all time. It's bad. I don't think it's the worst game of all time. The same guy who made A.T., he made Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark on the Atari 2600. Again, in the great 80s movie franchise. So, and I've been playing Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis, so it fits. So again, join me next Sunday at 5:30 p.m. Eastern for the movie watch along. And we're going to be calling that Master Cheese Theater. Master Cheese Theater. So again, thank you guys for joining me. Please follow me on Twitch at twitch.tv/Eddie_Akiva, or subscribe to the official BGBC Backlog Gaming Broadcast Company YouTube channel for archives of all my streams and the podcast. You can find the podcast on Spotify, wherever you can find your favorite podcasts. You can also follow me on Blue Sky at Eddie Akiva for real-time channel updates and announcements. You can find my Blue Sky link in my Twitch bio. And with that, folks, episode 1 is in the books. So good night, good luck, and remember, you got this. So, see you. Adieu. Bye.